James White versus Joe Heschmeyer debate. Is the Catholic Mass a propitiatory sacrifice? 12-5 Church, a Reformed Baptist church in John Burrow, Northeast Arkansas, hosted a debate between James White and Joe Heschmeyer on the question, is the Catholic Mass a propitiatory sacrifice? Elder Jeremiah Nortia moderated the debate, though both participants were professional and experienced enough that little moderation was required. The audience was relatively full, and the night opened with a prayer. This debate was part of a two-night event, with the previous night featuring a 2-on-2 debate on limited atonement, in which White also participated. The debate aired on the Apologetic Dog YouTube channel, which appears to be associated with the church that hosted the event. There was an evident bias in favor of White, as the moderator had been his debate partner the previous night, and White was also invited to preach at the church the following night. To understand the debate topic, we must define two words. For the question of whether the Catholic Mass is a propitiatory sacrifice is fundamentally about expiation, the offering of something precious to satisfy the need for appeasement and atonement. The term propitiatory in this context means the serving of a conciliatory offering intended to gain the favor of or to appease God. Typically, in debates of this nature, Catholic apologists argue against the Protestant definitions of these terms, claiming that Protestants misunderstand not only what these words, propitiatory, expiation, and sacrifice mean, but the opponents also misunderstand what the Mass entails, particularly concerning the Eucharist. However, this debate was unique in that Joe Heschmeyer did not take the usual defensive approach. Instead, his presentation resembled that of a Southern lawyer in a classic 1950s courtroom drama, which came across as crisp and comforting, while ironically, James White seemed stuck in outdated polemics, relying on old scripts and rehearsed arguments that lacked freshness. The debate lasted just over 2.5 hours, including host introductions, an intermission, and a farewell from the venue. The structure allowed for an in-depth discussion, but the engagement between the two debaters was often asymmetrical, with Heschmeyer taking a proactive stance and White struggling to respond effectively. Heschmeyer took the affirmative position, arguing in favor of the Catholic Mass as a propitiatory sacrifice. Heschmeyer, a Catholic apologist from Catholic Answers and a former attorney, utilized his legal training to present a well-structured and compelling argument. While I have previously critiqued Heschmeyer for occasional gaps in research as unthorough, sometimes perceived as overconfidence, laziness, or overreaching, this debate did not reveal such weaknesses, at least not to any significant degree. His opening thesis was that the salvific work of Jesus on Good Friday must be applied to believers' lives in some way. He asserted that Jesus' sacrifice is the definitive answer to sin, though he did not expand on this point as much as he could have throughout the debate. He argued that Catholic participation in the Holy and Divine Liturgy and the Mass is a participation in the one true eternal sacrifice. Unfortunately, he missed an opportunity to elaborate on the Catholic understanding of time in this context. Catholics believe that through theosis, becoming one with Christ as members of his mystical body, they participate in the one true sacrifice that transcends time. This includes the Last Supper, the crucifixion, and the resurrection, as God exists outside of time. White touched on this concept in his critique, but misapplied it to bolster his own anachronistic arguments about substitutionary atonement and his interpretation of John 6:39. Heschmeyer supported his case, using quotes from Luther, Calvin, and other Protestant reformers before contextualizing their quotes as thoughts reflecting on pagan and Hebrew sacrificial systems, which influenced how the early church understood sacrifice. He pointed out that the death of the lamb was not the end of the atonement ritual in Jewish tradition. Rather, the sin offering had to be consumed in communion to be efficacious. However, he neglected to mention that ancient blood rituals and contracts were made binding through similar practices. Another missed opportunity was the connection to rabbinical thought, where a Jewish tradition holds that all Jews, past and future, are mystically present at the covenant at Sinai. This perspective could have strengthened his argument by drawing a parallel to the Catholic understanding of Mass as a timeless participation in Christ's sacrifice. James White took the negative position, arguing against the Catholic Mass as a propitiatory sacrifice. White, who holds an unaccredited doctorate, is the longtime director of Alpha and Omega Ministries and a pastor at Apologia Church in Arizona. This was his 195th formal debate. However, it should be noted that White did not appear as sharp as in past debates. While his age and health are not relevant to the strength of his arguments, it was evident that his approach had not evolved with the times. Throughout the debate, White struggled to engage with Heschmeyer's presentation directly. Instead, he spent much of his time rehashing arguments from previous debates, as if he were a general reliving old battles. Since those debates, many of his claims have been refuted and rebutted countless times. Yet he refuses to adapt his arguments to or accept gigantic shifts in theological discussion over the last 30 years. This reluctance to evolve was striking and, at times, unfortunate. White himself seemed to recognize this, lamenting that Catholics never used to argue this way. Rather than engaging with Heschmeyer's points, White attempted to shift the focus onto the sacramental priesthood, which he denies exist. When this line of argument failed, he introduced unrelated topics such as indulgences, the papacy, and Marian dogmas, none of which were directly relevant to the debate topic. Heschmeyer did not take the bait and even called White out for these distractions. His dismissals of White's red herrings were skillful, and his ability to stay on topic was one of Heschmeyer's strongest points in the debate, a strength Del Tuggy and Leighton Flowers could learn from. White never presented a clear thesis, but his main argument appeared to be that an unbloody sacrifice cannot be propitiatory. He argued that Christ's sacrifice was once for all, referencing Hebrews 10, and asserted that it does not need to be perpetuated, but rather commemorated and remembered at the Lord's Supper. However, his argumentation relied heavily on linguistic nuances, such as past tense participles in English translations, that did not engage meaningfully with Catholic theology, which is not limited to interpretations based on the limitations of the English language. White also ventured into an argument against purgatory, mistakenly portraying it as a guaranteed assurance for Catholics. This mischaracterization weakened his credibility, as it demonstrated a misunderstanding or purposeful misrepresentation of Catholic teaching. Overall, his arguments were filled with strawman representations of Catholicism, which weakened his case. White has long believed that his understanding of Catholicism is more orthodox than that of modern Catholic apologists or even the last few popes, which leads him to dismiss theological development as inconsistent with true or original Christianity, instead stressing that sola scriptura and reliance on the Bible alone is the only way to discern proper and true theology. However, he fails to acknowledge that the Bible itself records theological development over time, and that his own interpretive framework is itself a post-biblical theological development. One notable moment in the debate was White's reference to doubts about the authenticity of St. Ignatius's letters. This is a legitimate question in secular scholarship, and one that has been discussed in both mythicist and anti-theist circles. It was unnecessary for Joe to attack White simply for raising the issue. The authenticity of these letters has been questioned by scholars featured on platforms like MythVision and History Valley, though the general consensus still supports their authenticity. Most of the action took place during the cross-examination, which is well worth watching, especially for those who enjoy seeing James White struggle under pressure. The audience Q&A was fairly standard, and neither debater had a chance to shine due to time constraints that prevented any dramatic moments. In my opinion, this was a good debate overall, and Joe Heschmeyer performed exceptionally well, securing a clear victory. White did raise one or two valid points, but his objections could not withstand scrutiny and mostly amounted to whines and distractions. I wish White would update his arguments to reflect current scholarship, as theological debate has advanced significantly since the 1990s. Addendum. In defense of James White, the fallout from James White's gaffe regarding St. Ignatius has escalated into an opportunistic feeding frenzy led by grifters like Cameron Bertuzzi and his brigade of content vultures. While White undeniably made an error in the debate, the reaction from these opportunists has been more about capitalizing on his mistake than engaging in a serious discussion about the historical and academic nuances of the issue. White's greatest failing was not in bringing up scholarly questions about the authenticity of the Ignatius letters, but in his refusal to admit it was the wrong moment to bring up such a large and sensitive issue, or being unwilling to admit that it was unrelated to the debate topic at hand. That said, there is legitimate debate in secular academia about the proper attribution of certain early Christian writings, including the Ignatius or the Ignatian corpus. Scholars often raise questions about authorship, historical accuracy, and textual transmission, not as a means of undermining Christianity, but as part of the rigorous process of historical inquiry. White's mistake was twofold. First, he flippantly introduced this complex academic issue in a debate setting as an unnecessary offhand gotcha, where such nuances could not be properly unpacked. And second, when he was confronted with backlash, he responded with his usual irascibility and stubbornness, rather than humility. Instead of admitting he had misspoken or that he had failed in his delivery of his point, he doubled down, issuing a defensive response video that only exasperated the controversy. It is no secret that White has a difficult time admitting errors. His confrontational nature and his pride or arrogance have long made him a divisive figure in apologetics. However, this does not justify the mob-like behavior of his critics, who have seized on this gaffe, not for the sake of academic rigor or correction, but for the personal and professional gain it gets them. It may get them. Cameron Bertuzzi and his ilk are not scholars. They are social media opportunists masquerading as intellectuals, using controversy as a means of boosting their own visibility and engagement. Their reaction to White's misstep has been less about correction and more about gaining clicks and views, revealing their own lack of integrity and charity. To be clear, White's assertion about Ignatius was careless, but the broader discussion it touches upon is entirely valid. Secular scholarship regularly questions the authorship and authenticity of all ancient texts, including those attributed to the Church Fathers. The field of textual criticism exists precisely to examine these issues, and disagreements among scholars do not necessarily imply that the traditional attributions are false, only that there is a degree of uncertainty that must be examined with intellectual honesty. When pushed back on during the debate, White could have clarified that questioning Ignatius's letters does not equate to rejecting them outright, nor does it undermine their theological significance. He could have acknowledged that while some scholars question aspects of the Ignatian corpus, the general scholarly consensus still upholds their essential authenticity. Instead, by responding defensively, he played into the hands of his critics and allowed them to control the narrative. Furthermore, there is a fundamental misunderstanding in apologetical circles regarding what academic consensus actually means. Consensus in secular scholarship does not imply absolute correctness or unanimity. It simply indicates that a majority of experts who specialize in a given field agree on a particular conclusion based on the available evidence. The nature of critical scholarship is to operate within probabilities, seeking the most reasonable conclusions given the current state of knowledge, and then to challenge those conclusions regularly and thoroughly. This stands in contrast to apologetics, which is a defense of faith-based beliefs, aka presumptions, which often seeks to establish confidence in those beliefs with possibility and emotional appeals or appeals to the senses. Apologists are not scholars in the strictest academic sense. An agreement within apologetic circles does not equate to scholarly consensus. The lesson for White and for all apologists is to be careful when bringing up secular scholarship, and when doing so, one must do their due diligence, which includes citing sources with precision. When referring to academia while in a debate, even a debate's cross-examination or audience Q&A, the debater, the answerer, must be clear about what is being claimed and what the implications of that claim are. White's failure was not in raising the question, but in the way he presented it, and his subsequent refusal to admit it was the wrong time to bring up the issue, even as a jab, joke, tease, or mock. As Christians, we should resist the urge to triumphalism and not take pleasure in his missteps. Instead, we should offer the charity that he has often denied to others. This does not mean excusing his error, but rather responding with fairness and forgiveness. White made a mistake, but his entire body of work should not be dismissed over one gaffe. If anything, this should serve as a lesson for all involved, apologists and critics alike, to approach theological discourse with greater care, intellectual humility, and a genuine desire for truth, rather than pursuing quick and cheap victories. While White's handling of the Ignatius issue was a faux pas, the way forward is not through petty schadenfreude or opportunistic grandstanding, but through honest and charitable engagement with the real academic questions at hand. Let this be a moment for reflection rather than ridicule, and may it serve as a reminder that all of us, regardless of our theological positions, can say stupid things, especially in front of large audiences. My final rating for this debate is a 4 out of 5. Thank you and good night.